boy, I moved down to this area, and my dad was in business, and everything came from Jacksonville. And I asked him, I said, why does everything come from Jacksonville? We're 150 miles from Jacksonville. We're 70 miles from Tampa. We can get everything out of Tampa. We can get from Jacksonville. Well, that's where everybody does business, from Jacksonville. Well, why was that? Nobody could explain to me. I know now, and I'm going to tell you why. It had to do with rivers. But Florida has an interesting, very, very interesting, fascinating history. If you haven't gotten into it, I know most of you from somewhere else, but Florida's history is very, very exciting. And it started with the Spanish. They're very brilliant. People think the Spanish there was, rough and crude and so forth, conquistadors and all that. They're very brilliant, brave, very far-reaching looking people. They came to here. Ponce de Leon came in the early 1500s, around 1520. He was in Cuba, what's now Puerto Rico and Cuba, and he decided to come up to Florida. He came up the coast of Florida in a ship, and he came up so far as got over toward the land in this area up in North Florida, and he landed in central South Florida and South Florida. In his landing zone, he got an arrow in the leg, and it was poison. I think it was a Calusa Indian shot him in the leg with an arrow, and he never got over. They took him back to Cuba, and he died of gangrene. But he was a very brave man, and we've now named Ponce de Leon Springs and Ponce de Leon. All of this. That was 1520. Now think about the time differences here. 40 years later, another Spaniard would land in Florida, Hernando de Soto. He would land around what is now Tampa, and he'd bring 300 or 400 men up, and he would come through all the way into the Carolinas and all the way over the Mississippi River, and he died in this country. But he was exploring, curious, very, very able man, lost his teeth, and we think it was right in Ocala. There was an Indian village, and he got there, and the Indians were suspicious. Somebody alienated him, and he got in a fight, and they hit him in the mouth and knocked his teeth out in Ocala. And he came up 301, was an Indian trail. People think that the Indians, that Florida was just a wilderness and there was a bunch of savages out there and wasn't anything. Florida was traversed with roads, paths, very, very wide trails, farms with fields. Indians were civilized people. South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, the Indians had cultivated and had learned many things. Of course, the Spanish brought something the Indians didn't have: horses. Before 50 or 75 years, the Indians were better horsemen than anybody, but they didn't have a horse. But Florida, they brought horses, so transportation then changed. How did the Indians move around Florida? They did it in dugouts, canoes. Dugout canoes, and they would go down these streams which Florida's traversed, and that's how they made speed going down streams. And we copied them and did the same thing. When I was a boy, you could go from Ocala to Pedro down an old dirt. It was a dirt road that had just been paved when I was coming up, but before then it was dirt road, heavy white sand and mud holes. And to go to Ocala was mule and wagon. You got up at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning and got away from there, and you got to Ocala around noon. And you had to water your mule 2 or 3 times in ponds along the way and unstrap them. They were creatures, and you had to do this to go anywhere. It wasn't like John Wayne running a horse for miles and miles and miles, and you were there in a few minutes. That's ridiculous. But transportation was very, very primitive. There's another Spaniard you should not only know about Florida's history, but St. Augustine. They traveled along the oceans in their ships, that was another way they could really travel fast. They could live on the coast and travel down and come in and supply themselves with ships. And the Spanish built a fortress in St. Augustine. How many of you have ever seen the Castillo de San Marcos? Its walls 20 feet thick, made out of coquina. And it was replacing a wooden fort that was built there in about 1560 or 1550. And of course the French tried to get in on it. And they built them a fort up in Jacksonville called Fort Caroline. The Huguenots, Protestant French came over, and they saw the Spanish, and they said, we're going to knock them off. So they took a ship down, and the Spanish had already seen what was going on, and they sent an individual you need to read about. His name was Pedro Menendez de Alvarez. Pedro de Alvarez Menendez. Pedro Menendez. Admiral Menendez was very, very sharp. He went up and destroyed their fort. They had gone down to attack him. They got caught in a hurricane, and they came ashore with no weapons. They were lucky to get out with their life, and they went over the inland waterway, got on an island for protection, had very few weapons left, and Menendez went down and found them, and they said, we surrender. He said, okay, I'll take your surrender 10 at a time. We'll send you back to France. No, we'll take care of you, I think he said, told him. He did. 10 at a time, he cut their heads off. All 350. So if you go to St. Augustine, below St. Augustine, Menendez, Matanzas Basin, you'll see the little fort the Spanish later built out there in the island where they brought them across in the dunes where they killed them in the dunes. Well, that's part of the legacy we have in Florida. And Spanish Florida was full of ranches, haciendas, Spanish language buildings. Gainesville had a large Spanish ranch, and the land was all claimed in land grants from the Spanish kings. And there was a great history for 300 years. The Spanish ruled Florida. Interesting. Then came the Americans. And I'll get down. We had 3 Seminole Wars. They called them Seminole, but they weren't really Seminole. That means wild man. But they put that name on them. They were Creek Wars with some Yemesis in it and some Calusas, the vestiges of them, and a lot of escaped slaves. And they came here, the original Indians. And this is a very tragic thing we don't ever hear about. The original Indians were totally destroyed in Florida. There was over 12,000 of them were enslaved, and by 1700 there were no original Indians in Florida. Then the Seminoles get pushed out of Georgia and Alabama, came into Florida, and that's where we got them. Osceola came in as a young Turk with his great uncle from Scotland who wore a tam, okay? Osceola was 1/8 Indian by blood. His great-grandfather was Scottish, his grandfather was Irish, his father was English. His grandmother, they were all raised, the women were all Creek Indians, and so he was raised in the Creek culture. At Fort King in Ocala, he stayed with the soldiers. When they had these big rugby matches, he would stay with the soldiers in the barracks. So he was not unfamiliar with it, and the Indian agent there gave him a rifle and tried to appease him. But that's another story for another time. But the Seminoles traversed Florida by horseback and by dugouts. And Florida, you couldn't go anywhere. I mean, it'd take you, if you went from here to Jacksonville or that area of Florida, you're talking about several weeks, 2 or 3 weeks to get somewhere. And then came the railroads. And I want to tell you a little bit about how Florida got into the railroads. I've got some pictures here. The early railroads, they were not what you think. They were beautiful machines, a lot of them made by Baldwin. and Florida Railroad were involved in second-hand engines. He was created by a Jewish American. He had changed his name from David Levy to David Levy Yulee, and it was his last name. His family's name was Yulee, and so he wanted to incorporate that, and he made the change. Florida, the South, was a haven for Jewish people. Now, you may not know that. Charleston has more Jewish people in it than any city in this country, north or south. And the charter was originally written by John Locke. And John Locke, when he wrote the charter for Charleston, wrote in there freedom. Jewish people could serve in the military, they could own property, and they flocked to Charleston and Savannah because of the heritage of freedom. They didn't enjoy that freedom anywhere in the world, hardly. And so Charleston, Ocala, when I was a boy, had these very, very, very old Jewish families. You know, kind of like driving Miss Daisy in Georgia. The mayor of Ocala was Marcus Frank when I was a boy. He had been a state representative, elected over and over and over. My aunt was always a big supporter of Marcus Frank, and he had a broken Lithuanian accent, and he was an old man when he was mayor. He'd be mayor over and over, and he'd beat the podium with a cane. And people would boo, boo, and then they'd elect him, okay? But he looked after Ocala. You had the Reinauers, you had the Leibowitz, you had the Goldmans, you had a number of Jewish families that had been in Florida for generations. And Pedro, how many have ever been to Pedro? It's named after my great-great-grandfather, Pedro Boyer Perry. And he was a Mexican War veteran. He got hit badly at the Battle of Lovell when they were taking the fortress in Mexico City. I've got his medical records from that war, and a one-inch ball from the cannons up there, a grape shot, hit him in the chest, just below the nipple on the right side. And I saw the diagram in it, and it knocked him out with such force that it welded the tissue to his rib cage. It was a very serious bruising hit. It just didn't penetrate. It was almost spent. But anyway, he stayed down there 18 months and picked up the pseudonym of Pedro. So he came back, eventually settled over there, and they named the community Pedro, because that's what everybody called him after the war. Unfortunately, he was drafted in the Confederate Army on the third draft, less than a month after Gettysburg, and he told his wife, my great-grandmother, he told her, I'm so glad that I'm too old to go. I've seen enough blood and guts in my life to ever want to go to another war. And I'm so glad I'm not going to have to go. And then he got drafted at 40 years of age. Came back 2 years later with his hair white. And he walked back from Appomattox to Charleston, living off the undigested grain and the mules and horses along the way, washing them in the creeks and baking them on his shovel. Caught a boat from Charleston to Savannah, and a barge from Savannah to Jacksonville. He caught a flat car all the way to Baldwin, and there the tracks were knocked out. And it was on one of these flat cars of the Florida Atlantic. Was actually that railroad that went from Jacksonville to Lake City was the Atlantic Ocean, was the Atlantic Railroad, and it was a Florida Atlantic and Gulf Central Railroad, and it went east and west. And then Yulee's railroad went from Fernandina, and it was supposed to go to Tampa, but it went to Cedar Key. How many of you have been to Cedar Key? Well, you don't see anything, but what you're seeing in Cedar Key today is a skeleton of what was. Cedar Key was a big port. It had a huge pier out. It had trains going out to the pier. Ships would come into the pier and unload their stuff, and they'd load it on Yulee's railroad. When my great-grandfather was drafted in the Confederate Army, he had to go to Cedar Key to sign up, and he had to go to Gainesville, catch the train in Gainesville, and go to Cedar Key to sign the paper. And that's, I guess they probably took him from there to some kind of, I think he went to Waldo or some place for encampment. And in those days, they didn't send you to boot camp. You knew that. They put you right in a military group, and then you learn by on-the-job training. Since he had already been a soldier, he was automatically made a third lieutenant. And then later on, he came back first sergeant of the company after Appomattox. But anyway, the Florida Railroad went from Cedar Key all the way up to Fernandina. Now you catch the train in Fernandina. These trains, this is another myth I found from people. You guys are historians, you want to be historians. Fight some of the myths. People think that the 19th century, they were ignorant. First of all, the census of 1860 shows that 95% of white people were literate. 55% of the slaves were literate. They had the telegraph that was developed in the early 1840s. By 1860, telegraphs were everywhere. They had them in Lincoln, Nebraska, for heaven's sakes. And anything that happened was telegraphed to Washington, to New York, to Chicago, to the big cities of the north. And what happened? Horace Greeley's press started printing them stories. Indian massacre in Alabama. By the next morning, that was in the newspaper. It was loaded on trains. Those trains went 35, 45 miles an hour. And they took, by that evening, those trains had unloaded newspapers all around, and the trains went in every direction. So by 1860, when something happened, people were reading it in the paper the next day, drinking their coffee. I mean, it was not, I've heard people say, well, they didn't get information until 2 months later. That is not correct. They got the information, and the newspapers then were very comprehensive about telling stories and getting it right. We can learn something from them. Anyway, let's go back to Yulee a minute. Yulee had a plantation over in Crystal River. You can see the ruins there where he made salt and sugar for the Confederate Army. He didn't want the war, but he was a solid supporter of the state of Florida. And the state of Florida was not a civil war. The state of Florida met, the legislators voted almost unanimously to pull out of the Union. How many of you are from Marion County? Any from Marion County? Well, if you were from Marion County, you're from Marion County, okay. If you were from Marion County commissioners met. And they had to choose the delegate. They chose the delegates, and then they had to charge the delegates to go to the Secession Convention, 1861. And they charged the delegates, and it's on the record. Go to Tallahassee and vote for secession. If Tallahassee doesn't vote for secession, stand up and tell them, Marion County is going to secede from Florida. Now, you think all those people were from the South, but most of those people were Northerners who'd come to Florida to make a new life, and they were very proud people, a lot from Massachusetts, okay? Massachusetts was known as free thinkers. So it wasn't exactly like people think it was. Think a bunch of rednecks doing this. It was not that way at all. Well, anyway, Yulee's family was originally from Europe, of course, and they moved, his grandfather moved to St. Thomas. How many of you have been to St. Thomas? You've been there? Well, you will know that St. Thomas is a unique place. Had 700 Irish mercenaries took it over. And if you go into those houses down there, you'll see a picture of a white man on the wall. They get darker and darker till they're solid black, okay? But originally they were Irish mercenaries took over the island. Well, his grandfather took it, got in the timber business, got to be very wealthy, and migrated to this country. He was Jewish. His cousin, you may know, was the Secretary of War of the Confederacy, Judah Benjamin. And he was kind of like the Albert Speer of the Confederacy. He kept it going financially when it should have collapsed. I've heard too many people say, well, it was Jewish, the anti-Semitic thing, he was Jewish making money off the railroad. No, he wasn't. He tried, he wanted to make, he was like Trump. What do you expect? He wanted to make money. But he was furnishing absolutely necessary items to the Confederacy. Salt and sugar was very, very scarce at that time. Yulee was a brilliant man. Started the railroad in 1853. He had no idea that it was going to be destroyed or there was going to be a war. He started this railroad. He had to get support from the state. He had to form a corporation. He had to raise money. He bought used locomotives and everything to start. They started in Fernandina and came south. Well, he got it done just in time for the war. By the time 1860 was when he started running this railroad. I've got some pictures here. I'll pass them around. You may want to see how beautiful those trains were. Some of these locomotives were beautiful trains, and they were pretty fast for that day. I mean, you could catch a train at 6 o'clock in Fernandina. 6 o'clock in the morning, and by noon you'd be in Gainesville, okay? And they stopped all along the way. And that was fast travel for those days. And it was very, very important. Well, what happened was, he no sooner got the railroad done and it was really going good, and the Yankees came in 1862 and burned the wharf, burned his railroad, running about 15 miles, and jerked up all the tracks. They also came into Fernandina in 1862 and took that end of it. So he finally had to retreat the railroad back to Baldwin and basically Gainesville. So the railroad ran between there, and then it was raided from time to time by Yankee cavalry. One of the interesting things about Yulee in his railroad is he was beset by all of these trains not being able to get parts for his trains, and the tracks deteriorating and no replacement parts, and the Yankees burning the tracks and tearing up his assets. In 1864, the Confederate Army moved in and said, wait a minute, we need to make a spur from Lovell up into Georgia and avoid all this coastal raids by the Yankees, and we can make this spur from the Gulf and Atlantic Central and run it up to Georgia and bypass all this stuff. Where can we get the rails from? And they said, oh, well, that's all that track's laying up there belongs to the Florida Railroad. That's good. So the Confederate Army went up there, just took his track and all of his equipment and one of his locomotives and stuff, and stole it. And of course, Yulee was furious. So he sued them in court. In Gainesville, they had the Confederate federal court had a judge, got a judgment on them, and the Confederate Army ignored the judgment. The major and the lieutenant and the engineers that were stealing the railroad, building this track from Lovell going up into Georgia, just taking this track. They would haul it down to the Gulf and Atlantic Railroad and then take it on. And they weren't paying for it at all. And so they got a judgment, and that didn't do any good. So the judge then got an injunction and summoned the officer to come to court, and he refused. He just said he didn't go to court. He just ignored it. So the judge said, well, I guess it says military necessity. So the judge said, okay, let's just drop the case. So that was the end of that. The railroad the spur never got quite finished before the war was over. But the railroad never recovered quite after that. They went into bankruptcy. And of course, Yulee then was put in prison as a war criminal for a year. He was tried and let go, but he stayed a year in prison. And so that ended. That was basically it was bought by a carpetbagger, and then it went into a large corporation, and then you know the history of the Atlantic coastline and the seaboard. Now, the other railroad, the Atlantic and Gulf Central, was an interesting thing because you probably never heard of him. It was Abel Baldwin, Dr. Abel Baldwin, where Baldwin has got his name from. Dr. Baldwin was a medical doctor in Jacksonville, and he got the idea to build this railroad about the same time the Florida Railroad was built, except a little earlier. And so he raised money and formed a corporation, and they built the railroad from Jacksonville to Lake City. It was called the Gulf Atlantic Central. And he also became the head of the Medical Association, which is still still has his name on it, Dr. Abel S. Baldwin Medical Association. And that's, to me, very interesting. Now, I've got about 3 minutes. The biggest railroader in Florida, of course, was Henry Flagler. You cannot study Florida history without knowing Flagler. Flagler was the genius who originated Standard Oil. Rockefeller was just went with him, but Flagler was the brains. If you read anything about it, was the brains behind it. He pulled out after he went to St. Augustine, liked it, built a hotel there. I won't go into all the details, but he loved St. Augustine. He decided he was getting up in age, and he had worked and boy, a ruthless businessman, but he had worked for all those years, and he pulled out a Standard Oil, and he wanted to build this railroad. Florida East Coast Railroad. I'll give you facts. You're all historians, this historical society. Facts. Longest railroad in the United States. You know that? Fact. Most expensive railroad in the United States. Not the North, not the Central, or not the Great Northern or Santa Fe. The Florida East Coast. Most expensive in the United States. Killed more people building it. More people died building it. Had more problems building it. And it ended up in Key West from 1892 to 1912. Now, he got 1,000 acres for every lineal mile. He got 2,000 acres for every lineal mile. He ended up with 2 million acres of land as subsidy for that railroad. Nobody was rich. And he ended up and if you go to the Grand Flagler Hotel on the beach. How many of you have ever been there? And he built that with seawater. He couldn't. They didn't have enough water to make the concrete and do it. And so he got the German formula for making concrete out of seawater, and he built this big hotel. And he built it like a fortress, and it has withstood everything. He was the one that named Miami. Flagler named Miami. Flagler's got Flagler Island on it with a statue and all of this. Flagler named most of the streets, the Boca Raton. I mean, Flagler took an island that was nobody wanted, Palm Island, wrecked their ship in the 1700s. when coconuts floated up and grew up in coconut trees, and nobody wanted swamps, Flagler saw it anyway. Who's Lord? And he built West Palm Beach. When of course, if you go to Palm Beach, you have to go to the Flagler House, and you have to go to the one in St. Augustine. He loved St. Augustine, he's buried in St. Augustine, but he was some kind of individual that we very, very seldom run into. He was a pretty ruthless businessman, but they didn't have any laws then, like we do now. But I'm sure if they had laws, he would have obeyed.